All right, everybody, I want to welcome you back to day 2 of the Python Web Conference. I am joined by Lorena Mesa, who is going to be our final speaker of the day before we get to closing remarks and anything else. I hope everyone's had a wonderful day, and I'm super excited to end it with this awesome speaker. She is the biggest data nerd I know, I think. So I will let her talk more about that. So I'll turn it over to Lorena. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great. Thank you so much, Calvin, for this opportunity. Calvin and I were just commenting on how cool it is to be able to be simulcast, I think is a word. If not, I'm running with it along all the tracks. And I really appreciate folks participating in this event. I know that all of us being wherever we are around the world and us trying to all make it work, it's been really cool just to see the way that while we may not be physically together, the way we've been able to continue to be together and lean into great technologies like Python and like web technologies to help us do that. So again, my name is Lorena Mesa, and I am gonna go ahead and start kicking off my talk, which is titled, Why I Talk About Ethics When I Talk About Technology. As a heads up, I am a big believer in making sure that I connect you with all the resources that I talk about. So these slides are available at bit.ly/whyethics-lmesa. They also will have all the links. So if you see like photos and imagery, if you click on that, generally there will be a link embedded in it. And if there is a resource that for some reason I left out, please do let me know. I will make sure to get that in there because information is power, and I want us all to be leaving with a little bit of some knowledge that we can apply to do a thing. So great. Okay, so let's go ahead and kick that off. So as I've said now for the second time, my name is Lorena Mesa, and a little bit about me. I do a few things in technology. So a few of the things that I do that may be of proximate interest to you all. I'm an organizer for PyLady Chicago. Chicago is where I'm based. I'm also currently the vice chair and a director on the Python Software Foundation Board of Directors. Additionally, I work at GitHub, so that is what I do my day job as a technologist. And then some other things that I'm passionate about include championing responsible computer science and technology. If you're ever looking to have a chat and you want to engage on a social media platform, you can find me on most spaces with the social handle Lorena Nicole. Yes, that is L and 4 O's, then Nicole with the final O in Nicole, so that is 5 O's, on Twitter or Instagram. Actually, my GitHub handle is Lorena Nicole, just 1 O, but needless to say, I'm quite present on social media and would be very happy to chat with you. And again, that's where I will share my slides after the fact. So a bit about me though outside of tech. I would say that I'm a person who has lived a life of many things. I guess you can say I'm a woman of many passions, be it studying martial arts or geeking out hardcore in my Star Trek attire at all of the cons. Like all of us in the Python community, we are the product of our own passions, interests, family histories, racial and ethnic backgrounds, and that much more, all of which make up our unique identities. A relatively interesting fact about me, or at least something I would say is a little eccentric, is that I'm a long distance runner. Or more specifically, I am a marathoner. And a marathon, for those of you who may not know, is 26.2 miles. Yes, 26.2, do not leave off the last 0.2 miles, which is about approximately 43 kilometers. To date, I have ran 13 Chicago marathons, and I have no plans to stop anytime soon. A life goal of mine is to run all of the world majors, which includes the Tokyo Marathon, the Boston Marathon, the London Marathon, the Berlin Marathon, the New York Marathon, and Chicago. Regrettably, but understandably, my plans have been put on hold as the Berlin Marathon, which I was to run this year, was canceled for 2020. So as a journey, I hope to continue this in the future when it is safe for me to do so. However, this passion for running, for slogging through weeks of training, putting in mile after mile, is often met by confusion. Folks often ask me, well, first just kind of be like, wait, you've ran 13 marathons? Folks will then likely ask me one of two questions. Why? Or just staring at me blank. But generally we settle on questions like, why do you do it? What is it that you get out of it, Lorena? And that's generally when I start thinking about a favorite book of mine, a memoir by the amazingly talented Japanese author Haruki Murakami, titled What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. When I talk about running, I talk about several things, including what it means to me and how that meaning connects to my sense of self and my purpose. So when thinking about how to prepare this talk, I initially was thinking about commenting on the role of Python and the web, and how both Python and the web have helped us develop new workflows, helping us to coexist during this pandemic. How it is that Python and the web is bringing us together even when we are apart. But then another worldwide movement has taken hold. No longer is it that we are just living in a pandemic, but we are living through a reawakening of what equity means in the here and now. Of those issues focusing on equity, racial equity is at the forefront of this movement. It is impossible for us to ignore. It is impossible for us not to see. Walking through my neighborhood, there are public murals everywhere calling us in, inviting us to participate in this discussion, inviting us to reckon with what is happening in the world around us. So in thinking about how this topic of equity impacts me and my work, my sense of purpose, what it is I do and what it is we do in the world, I began by reflecting on one question. What is it I talk about when I talk about technology? Technology can mean many different things to different folks. It could mean the future. It can mean a paycheck. It can mean tools and frameworks, many of which you may have been learning about over the last 2 days here at Python WebConf. Or perhaps it's, when you think of technology, it's something you think about taking a selfie with, which honestly, I do like taking selfies. I often have my little Python plush and I'm posing with it all over the places. But for me, when I talk about technology, I start talking about my home. So as I have said, I'm from Chicago, home of the first skyscraper, the home insurance building built in 1884, the first Ferris wheel. And yes, we are the creators of the deep dish pizza, which I am sorry to tell you, any true Chicagoan will inform you that no, we do not eat deep dish pizza. That is left for activities of the tourists so they can have tummy aches when they've eaten way too much cheese. However, the popular moniker for Chicago, the Windy City, does not come from the wind itself, but instead is a throwback to Chicago's aggressive competitive bid to host the 1893 World's Fair, which yes, Chicago did eventually win. Myth has it that a warning was issued by New York Sun-Times editor Charles Dana in 1890 for readers to ignore the nonsensical claims of that Windy City, explicitly describing that the politicians of Chicago are full of hot air. So while Dana was a popular dissenter of Chicago, these words weren't exactly found in his editorial print, but the theme of exaggeration and corruption were quite popular ideas of Chicago at the time, and hence the name of the Windy City stuck. So yes, Chicago is a city that I have always called home, and I'm very proud of it. With family roots in Mexico, Cuba, and Spain, my family came to settle in Chicago, and there I have stayed. In 2009, I graduated from Northwestern University with a degree in political science. Like today in 2009, there was a movement at least circulating around Chicago and the continental or the United States at that time. And this movement could perhaps be best described by the political phrase of a certain campaign, change we can believe in. So as a bright-eyed college grad living in Chicago, I joined this movement and this campaign working on the Latino Vote team. The role of the internet and the technologies making heavy use of the internet were instrumental to this campaign's success. Quote, were it not for the internet, Barack Obama would not be president. Were it not for the internet, Barack Obama would not have been the nominee. Adriana Huffington, editor of the Huffington Post, proclaimed. So how was it that the internet informed this groundbreaking campaign? Well, the strategy was multifold. For example, the extensive use of social media. For example, using YouTube to do what we would call hometown kind of meetings. So using social media in innovative ways like that to bring us together around discussions of policy and equity. Another way that these technologies were groundbreaking in the campaign was Get Out the TV, which is short for GOTV, drives informed by data science. And last but not least, these customized fill in the blank for Obama interest groups. An example of which may have been Women for Obama, Latinos for Obama. There was quite a few of them. These personalized groups for Obama reflect the complexity of one's identity, specifically in the United States around the Latinx community. For example, the map on the left-hand side shows the village where my abuelo, my grandfather, comes from, Piedras Negras. And one of the earliest lessons I remember my abuelo teaching me in life was, Mija, we did not move, the border moved on us. And as you can see, specifically this tract of land is right along what is the current border of Mexico and the United States. But actually in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo moved the border between the United States and Mexico quite a large way, actually moving this part of border territory from being in part of Mexico to actually being in part of the United States. So in this area of Texas, many may not consider themselves Latinx, a term used to describe people of Latin American heritage, but instead may identify with the term Tejano, emphasizing this connection with Mexico, with the South, or with Latin America. These types of nuances in labels, therefore, were incredibly important for us for how we did our work on the Obama Latino vote team. The Obama for America 2008 campaign was pulling data from non-traditional sources like social media, building models to target and interact with their key demographic audiences in new personalized fashions. So what kind of skills were necessary for this? Predictive analytics, answering questions such as, given X percent of turnout of voters on election day, how likely were we to win? How many more people did we need to register in order to win? Or having skills to do sentiment analysis. Was our messaging resonating with those folks we were trying to reach out to? Or perhaps mapping, were we best using our assets to meet the needs of our 4 key states on the Latino vote roadmap? So we had 4 key states we were working in. These type of problems, which can be solved by data science, drew from so many areas of expertise, including many types of subject area expertise, as well as math and programming. However, as the sole intern/staffer based in headquarters for the Latino vote team for the Obama for America campaign in 2008, I was not situated to take this all on alone, nor did I have the necessary tech skills to help me get what I needed to do done. That's where I came to Python. So founded in 2003, Chicago Python User Group, or CHIPPY as we affectionately call it, is one of the most active user groups in the world, with more than 3,000 members and many famous alumni such as David Beasley or Naomi Cedar, or co-founder of Django, Adrian Holvati. Apologies on the last name. CHIPPY is a must stop for any Pythonista visiting Chicago. Therefore, it was only a logical resource for me to turn to in 2009 when I was struggling to keep up with the requirements of what I needed to get done. And it was here then I stayed when I found myself eventually leaving politics as my profession and entering a career in engineering. Chicago Python User Group was always a place I could ask questions, a place I could grow, and a place I could learn. So, which leads me then from the second most frequent topic I talk about when I talk about technology. I talk about responsibility, specifically the responsibility I have as a technologist. So alongside my own journey in Chicago after university, where I moved from being a technology consumer to a technology producer, Chicago continued to develop in its own way. The last 40 years of Chicago can be summed as such. The wealthy in Chicago continued to get wealthier. The least wealthy continued to lose access to capital. And the folks in the middle class, relocated to the suburbs. However, this story can also be quite visibly seen on a map. As you can see on the right-hand side, the northwest side of Chicago, where the most affluent communities in Chicago are, these also happen to be the spaces where most white communities are. Whereas the south and west sides of Chicago, where there are visibly, where there's a very, very stark, visible lack of access to infrastructure like transportation or healthcare and big food deserts, these are areas where there's a large BIPOC number of communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. These areas also happen to have higher arrest rates and are subject to heavier policing. So in 2007, when then Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel was focusing on crime, he specifically said he wanted to invest in tech to help curtail the rising rates of crime. And specifically, he wanted to help combat the image of Chicago as the most dangerous city in the United States. And how did Rahm propose to do it? He proposed to do it with innovative predictive policing strategies. And these predictive policing strategies were to be heavily employed in Chicago's South Side. In describing what predictive policing strategies are, it was suggested that these strategies could identify people who were expected to become victims or criminals even before a crime happened. Therefore, the Chicago Police Department could, quote, send officers to go and visit people to warn them against committing a violent crime before it happened. Another predictive police strategy included the development of a strategic subject list dashboard, which would generate a score of 1 to 500 plus, with the higher score indicating a higher likelihood that that individual would be more aggressive. This score would be used on an officer dashboard when an individual was being pulled over. The algorithm developed by researchers at the Chicago Institute of Technology, the Illinois Institute of Technology, or IIT for short, basically thought about this algorithm in twofold. One, they would use data from past arrests. They would look at weapon offenses. They would look at data on narcotics usages and use that to help generate a score. But then additionally, they would adjust the score by connecting the data gathered around an individual and amplify it with insights derived from social networks of being able to understand who that individual may have relationships with. The logic here being that when you arrest an individual, they may be arrested with other people. So then there was this idea of being able to say there was an add-on value, new insight derived from linking the activity of known associates back to that individual, and that could then be used to infer something about if an individual is more likely to be aggressive or not. Unfortunately, the way that this information would be presented in the dash with this 1 to 500 plus score in a dashboard did not exactly present to you how that insight, how that data was, what that data was, or how that score was being generated. This right visual shows you a prototype of what that dash was to look like. On the immediate dashboard, you would get some high level stats, but then in a separate tab would be this information explaining a little bit of that black box as to how this score was generated. Therefore, this predictive score shapes not only who gets targeted by proactive police intervention, but also this information seemingly is presented as a black box. Coinciding in 2017 into 2018, a Guardian expose covering the systematic problems of policing in Chicago broke. The nature of the scandal involved the discrepancies of data following approximately 7,000 people who were held in custody by Chicago Police Department. Sometime during their time in custody with Chicago Police Department, folks were being disappeared. And those folks that were being disappeared would not be able to have access to lawyers, would not be able to have access to loved ones who were trying to find them. When it was discovered who these folks were that were largely being disappeared at some point during their custody with Chicago Police Department, overwhelmingly these individuals are BIPOC folks. This police misconduct and the consistent abuse of individual rights required extensive Freedom of Information Acts in order to obtain that data to understand what was intentionally left missing for external users to try to sift through. With the Chicago Justice Project and in greater collaboration with Chicago Hack Night, or Chi Hack Night, we helped bring this data to light and helped hold the police accountable, eventually turning over our research to the news agency, The Guardian. In doing this work, we employed Python. So while all of this was unfolding, we saw continued discussion around the flawed use of technology in critical decision-making. Again, in the space of law enforcement with facial recognition technology, where questionable tools were being used and sold to law enforcement, such as Amazon's Rekognition, which not only had questionable accuracy rates, but actually over-identified BIPOC folks as criminals. And again, we're using problematic data sets, such as mugshot data sets, which are known to introduce bias, racial bias in who is actually included in mugshots, as well as the image quality of mugshots themselves are highly problematic. And if that was not enough, by the middle of 2018, tensions were rising very, very much in Chicago when there was a highly visible murder trial of Laquan McDonald unfolding. This was not only a very visible murder trial, but also it was because the nature of the murder itself, where an unarmed Black teenager was shot 16 times, and that incident was captured by a dash camera and was intentionally withheld from the public for a period of time. So while I was working with Python to bring accountability and responsible to the Chicago Police Department with my work with the Chicago Justice Project, I was confronted with an ethical dilemma. An ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU brought a lawsuit against a series of companies selling social media software to Chicago Police Department. One of those companies listed was a company that resold software that I actually helped build with my last employer. And yes, that technology involved Python. The lawsuit itself went into talking about the unconstitutional use of social media tracking, explicitly calling out how this software was being targeted and through marketing and sold to law enforcement, with some of the research in the ACLU lawsuit explicitly talking about how using social media software could actually act as surveillance and monitoring, allowing law enforcement to be able to plug in keywords and hashtags and then set an alert for when those were trending in real time, so that the Chicago Police Department could help follow folks who may or may not be protesting or associated with the movement. Of those hashtags that were being targeted in marketing materials that the ACLU brought forth in this lawsuit included following hashtags such as Black Lives Matter, Don't Shoot, I'm Unarmed, It's Time for Change, and more. Needless to say, I had to have a very hard conversation with myself. And if this image isn't, for those of you who may not know what this image is, this is an image taken of Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook when he was called to answer questions in front of the US Senate Intelligence Committee about questionable practices that were involved in the 2016 US politics, specifically about how data was either fraudulently acquired through Facebook and helped thwart the 2016 presidential campaign election. In looking at this image, any of us can be that technologist in front of the camera having to answer those questions, or at least that's what I see when I look at this image. So in having that hard dialogue and having that hard conversation with myself, I ultimately had to ask myself, what is right and what is wrong? What do I hold myself accountable for and what don't I? Luckily with Python, I'm able to go many places to find meaningful, gainful employment. However, the passage of time is not lost on me. How strange it is to have come full circle with technology. What began as a powerful way for me to enact change through the innovative use of data science and social media as a staffer on Obama for America, now some 10 years later, has become an area where we see some questionable practices happening in tech. What does it mean to be a responsible technologist? How do we understand the impact of the tech that we put into the world? How can we do better? So in thinking about what I talk about when I talk about technology, not only do I talk about my home and how I got involved in tech, not only do I talk about responsibility, but I talk about ethics. So in talking about tech and responsibility and thinking about ethics, I imagine some of us, if we ever took a course in ethics, perhaps you took a philosophy course in university, or maybe at some point you watched, you've watched some popular television shows like The Good Place, where they have some introductions into what is ethics and how do ethics apply to me. Ethics is kind of this murky thing. And I think as technologists, we don't engage as often as we ought to in what ethics are. So in thinking about what ethics are, is ethics the language of right or wrong? Is it about our rights and responsibilities? Or is it about something else? So in thinking about ethics, a definition that I like to use is not necessarily a definition as much as I like to say it is a framework. And this framework, this three-part framework provided to us in the 2016 Philosophical Transactions publication by Floridi and Todeo, they encourage us to think about ethics in three ways. One, the ethics of data. For example, how is data created? How is data recorded? How is data shared? Two, the ethics of algorithms. How artificial intelligence, machine learning, robots, or how is it the tech interprets data? And then three, the ethics of practice. So devising responsible innovation and professional codes to guide this emerging science, for example. A kind of quintessential reading that I recommend many folks to look at includes the publication from Kathy ONeill, the kind of pop culture what is ethics in technology manifesto, if you will. But I think that Kathy ONeill, who's a former quant who worked on Wall Street and then became a prominent activist in the Occupy movement, her work understanding the impact of the 2008-2009 financial crisis that was brought on by the mortgage collapse in the United States, which had systemic impacts felt around the world. Kathy ONeill had a moment of reckoning when she began to ask herself questions about how it was that she, as a technologist, not only consumer, but producer, was helping build and reify bias in the world around her. Explicitly, the way that Kathy ONeill challenges us to think about it, if we think about ethics through the idea of data, quote, big data processes codify the past. They do not invent the future. Doing that requires moral imagination, and that's something only humans can do. We have to explicitly embed better values into our algorithms, creating big data models that follow our ethical lead. And sometimes that means putting fairness ahead of profit. In the kind of continued space of this work with Kathy ONeill, introducing a myriad of products and ways that we can understand how tech has made big decisions for us in ways that we may not understand, from recommending financial instruments to college rankings to insurance providing opportunities. Other activists and researchers have picked up the call and asked this question: what does it mean when we talk about tech and bias and equity? What do we as technologists need to think about as we create tools and put them into the world? The second publication here, Algorithms of Oppression, by Dr. Noble, for example, explores the construction of search engines and basically talks about how we as humans, when we are searching and looking up questions that our biases in our search results can actually, by effect, index certain research results to the top, and then that becomes the top article clicked on. And in that process, reinvents knowledge systems that we may or may not have thought about when folks were creating search engines. Dr. Noble then continues and explores that more in thinking about the intersectionality of race and other parts of identity that algorithms, intentional or not, may have had impact on. The publication on the right, Chaos Monkeys, actually talks about the creation of Facebook ads and what that product actually does and how it sifts through information, and how the profit model that of a seemingly free product is actually our data and what the data economy does do. So in thinking about all of those and all of these areas of research, if we were to move from going into data into actually thinking about the ethics of algorithms itself, there's many ways we can think about this conversation. So the landscape of machine learning is an area where many of us talk about this. And obviously in looking at machine learning, there's many spaces where we can continue to have a more nuanced conversation, be it from the tools that we use to the types of research and the algorithms we embed in our tools, et cetera, et cetera. And then if we were to think about ethics of practice, there's many ways that people are trying to think about how it is we have an upfront dialogue about practices and principles. One such attempt to adapt the Hippocratic Oath from the medical field and apply it to perhaps technologists in thinking about what would it mean to take, for example, a pledge or have some set of core values that we as a profession agree to abide by. One such example, the Data for Democracy Oath, kind of gets into this thinking about what this could look like and what kind of things that we as a professional sector ought to agree to hold ourselves accountable for. And then there's other folks who are using open source to continue to think about this, to continue to think about the impact of the work that we do through other ways. For example, in continuing in the work on data, for example, are there ways that we can have industry standards? We can think about ways of creating regulation or even just professional standards for ourselves. For example, this research project, the data nutrition label that is a project out of MIT's Media Lab, proposes that we think about, if we're using data sets, is there some way that we can, like a food label, come up with a set of universal kind of stats and markers to help us understand the bias and nuance of what our data sets introduce, and maybe then allow us to think about ways we can counterbalance if we do have to use a data set that may be a little bit limited in its scope or its reflection of the world. And lastly, I always encourage, something that I know I've been really passionate about has been the space of education, and how we as a group of professionals not only ourselves talk about it, but continue to make sure that we bring this dialogue into the formal training of the next generation of technologists. One such group that has been looking and thinking through this is Mozilla in their exploration of the Responsible Computer Science Challenge, of which I have been a part of helping create some of that curriculum. And now that grant is currently funding some projects in universities which are currently being piloted. And in thinking about kind of the spectrum and space of where you think about ethical computer science, actually making a rubric or some kind of guidelines for us to start thinking about what it means when we introduce ethics into formal education is definitely an area that I believe there's a lot more room for improvement on. So all that to say, you know, as we're talking about fairness, as we're talking about equity, as we're talking about bias, this is going to have many manifestations and usages for you. So it may mean talking about fairness in machine learning. It may talk about investing in open source tooling and finding common standards that we all can build on together, or it may require us actually thinking about ways that we can help educate the next generation. So when I talk about technology and what I talk about when I talk about technology, yes, it includes me, my home, and my journey, and the lessons I have learned around the way and about how to be responsible, how to be accountable, how to think about technology from an ethical standpoint. But all this is all prefaced on the fact that we need to continue to make sure that the folks building tech are as diverse and as the users of technology around us, and that that space where we create community is inclusive. As we see with the Python community, we are a great example of having a very, very rich and diverse set of use cases, be it if you look on this right-hand side with the Python developer survey results, where we see a myriad of use cases, from data analysis to DevOps to web development. Python is a place where many peoples of different use cases come and they meet. And as we all know, Python has exploded in popularity because of its ability to embed itself well in multiple use cases. So knowing that we have this rich use case, knowing that we have many folks from different disciplines, another way we can continue to invest in our community is to understand how it is we actually build community globally. And as a member of the Python Software Foundation, we as a community actually have access to grants where we can continue to invest in Python programming around the world. So some snapshots of data from 2019, looking at that grants program and seeing how we can continue to invest in our community, be it we're sponsoring an event that's in the United States or investing in events elsewhere. The grants program helps us continue to make sure that we're meeting people where they are at. Roughly speaking, we had about $324,000 that were used in 2018 for 51 countries through the grants program, which was, by the way, a 22.6 increase from 2017. So all of this kind of work is another way in which we can think about what it means to build equitable tech. Quite explicitly, the Python Software Foundation, in its mission statement, not only talks about promoting and protecting and advancing the Python programming language, but again, talks about the intentional support and facilitation of a diverse and international Python community. So when I talk about tech, I talk about ethics. And why do I talk about ethics? It's because I talk about us. To me, talking about technology is very personal. It is about my own journey, how I started working on passion projects to help build a better world, and then finding that Python has been a great place for me to continue to do that work. However, this work is not done, and this work requires us all. So I call on us all, as technologists, it is our duty to stay informed. This does mean educating ourselves on bias in tech, as well as understanding how tech impacts and amplifies issues of equity. The decisions we make in how we build and use tech can have a real, negative, or positive impact. I've started a reading list that covers some of these topics and more. And and if you have suggestions and would like to continue to add on to them, I've got a GitHub repository which points to a website, biasin.tech, that I would love for us to continue to crowd share. And lastly, education is not enough. We must continue to engage, and we must continue to do the work. And so here are a few places for us to think about it. The Algorithmic Justice League is a really cool, interesting project that hyper focuses on tech, but there's obviously a myriad of ways we can do that. We can do it through reading and meeting together and starting a dialogue. We can think of it more explicitly through policy or through hyper local kind of movements in our areas, but our community is global. I loved going to PyCon Africa, where this was a snapshot from last year, and our problems and the work that we do, we all have some overlap in some of the bias and equity issues, but how that gets manifest is different based on where we are located in the world. So it is incumbent upon all of us to continue to engage and continue to show up to do the work. So I would like to thank you for sitting with me and going on this journey and thinking a little bit about the importance of ethics in tech and the importance of understanding what ethical tech means. If you do have any questions, I would definitely love to stay in touch. That is my personal email address as well as my Twitter handle. And I thank you all for the opportunity to be able to share a little bit of some of my thoughts that are top of funnel for me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. That was a truly meaningful talk, especially in these times. There's been a lot of discussion in the Slack channel for the keynote about, I guess, fairness, humans, technology, bias, where does it all lie? I'm going to see if I can distill a couple of these ideas into maybe a couple questions. The first one that kind of kicked it all off was, is it ethical for a politician to dice and slice the demographics to target the message to the person he or she is talking to?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I feel like I've learned a lot of lessons I know I've learned a lot of lessons about thinking about unintended consequences, and in being very open about lessons I've learned along the way. I think that was a really big reckoning for me in thinking about, for example, heavily investing in something in the latest and shiniest new toy, let's say, without maybe perhaps thinking about what the long-term impacts could be. So, is it ethical for a politician to slice and dice data in the way that they want? I would actually say I feel like many of us do this in the pursuit of our own truth, of how we want to build the tools we want to build. So I feel as if maybe the question about is it ethical is perhaps I think perhaps the idea of like, is it ethical for someone to do something like that has to sit alongside other considerations around what is the problem you're trying to solve, who's involved in the process of how you're building out that solution. And, I guess for me, the hard part is always understanding the hyperlocal kind of application and use of something. So I would say that what ethics can provide us, if I think about it from the perspective of data, algorithms, and practice, I would say, if the end goal was to try to justify something that infringes on human rights, it's quite difficult. But I think if we try to at least understand and have a dialogue through kind of this multi-tiered framework, we can at least get to ways to understand where there may be challenges and ways we can do better.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. There was a bit of discussion then around people who are cloud users and adopters of this technology, that blaming cloud technology for their misuse by some users, you're blaming the maker of the knife and not the person who used it to kill anybody. I'm going to add my own twist on top of this question, because it wasn't a question, it was mostly comments that we're going through. Do you think it's ethical for Google to release these algorithms or frameworks when they know they can't accurately remove bias? They're only mirroring what they hear. And if that is being able to be manipulated, are they in the wrong by allowing us to even use those technologies?
Yeah, I think in a place we are really seeing this is around the discussion of facial recognition technology.
Yes.
And particularly what I think is happening there is if as individuals, we are individuals, meaning us as technology creators, if we aren't vigilant in starting that dialogue, then I think things will the wheels in motion kind of stay in motion. To quote like the law of inertia, a body at rest stays at rest, a body in motion stays in motion. So I think we have to kind of think about it on the side of, unfortunately, I believe many of us have had experiences where we either, again, the impact can be cool, like can be a positive or a negative. It's hard for us to know what someone's going to innovate and adapt something to use. But what we can perhaps do instead is thinking about ways in which we can be more transparent about how tech is used. We can empower technologists to have spaces within their corporate practices or their personal practices to upfront maybe start thinking about what kind of framework you could bring in about how do you kind of build in mechanisms to say, can we roll something back? How do we try to find ways to collect feedback as something is being used? I don't know if we're ever going to have an answer to, I've always thought of all the use cases, because what we continue to see is humans are really, really smart. We adapt, we evolve. So I don't know if we're going to answer that question, but I think if we think about ways that we can pull in other stakeholders, if we can think about ways to acknowledge problems and also concede that maybe sometimes the tech that we're building may require other things to happen first. So for example, maybe around facial recognition, thinking about and expecting and actually saying we need some kind of legislation in place. Because what I would say maybe around that conversation is, I don't think we would have a universal way that we can tell law enforcement how to do what it does, because what happens in Chicago may be very different than happens elsewhere, right? And there's kind of these local nuances that are hard to pinpoint. So for me, I think it's very much about technologists engaging in being transparent, engaging in actually thinking about problems that can happen, us acknowledging what that looks like, and also maybe asking the question of, is just because we can do it, should we do it? So I think that there's a lot of ways we can kind of address that conversation within our own practices and try to build that within, if our practice is our immediate sphere of influence, like maybe within your place of work or another association you're a part of. But there's ways that we can kind of come together to kind of start thinking about what that hierarchy looks like and what we can start with.
There was another question about the Personal Data Protection Act. Do you believe that it is a solution, and will it make tech ethical? And are some technologies like guns?
What I think it's hurt people, I think is kind of the way I heard that summed up. Oh, let's see. I do think that, I don't know. I guess I'm not exactly clear if, I think because we haven't maybe had a good reckoning about when to do something, when not to do something. And since I haven't really been in a lot of those kind of conversations, I believe that if we as a community continue to show up and engage with one another, and for me in particular, that's going to be if we are building tech that makes critical decisions for a user who's not a part of the conversation building the tool, I don't know if I would have the right answer that is indeed is the weapon that causes harm. I think for technologists, some of the things to think about is we're not always going to have the answer, and a lot of humility goes a long way. So I think part of the ways that I would want to understand and participate in that conversation is by showing up, staying engaged for the long haul, and rather than trying to say we have to over architect a perfect solution, try to start with the obvious things that we have some very clear conundrums around. So that may mean things that are being purchased by law enforcement, by government. It may mean for us when we having transparency about how we build tools and understanding then where things can possibly go off the rails. I think as we engage more into that work, we will maybe start to understand what kind of things really don't have an add-on value and can be left behind, but maybe then expand the ways that we ask questions. What I did not get into in this talk, which I think is an interesting area of research, is continuing down this line of fair, accountable, transparent, ethical algorithms, which ask kind of different ways of, rather than incentivizing maximum profit, maybe it's about thinking about, maybe we have this shared idea of fairness, meaning we have a different criteria that we're optimizing for. And in your space of work, let's say you work in healthcare or you work in insurance, maybe it's that people of different populations have equal access to the product that you're offering. So I think these things are very much informed. I think there's ways that when we start having this dialogue, that when we continue to come together as community, we will find that there is just some things that have really, really bad limits, but then there are ways we can continue to reiterate on this conversation. And ideally, by engaging with folks who are intending to be the users and following cues from stakeholders, we can advance kind of what that dialogue looks like, and then think about that better from a technology perspective.
No, exactly, absolutely. We're over time, but I'm going to go for one more question because you'll have to check out the Keynote Slack channel afterwards, because there was a flurry of conversation going on, as you can imagine, with this kind of a topic. The last question, I'm sure you're expecting this to come, but asking about the No Tech Force movement and ICE and GitHub. But I think maybe you can kind of, I don't know if you can say anything about that, you probably can't, but it sounds like you've already kind of reiterated, like even if someone is producing a programming language that is used to make horrible programs for heinous purposes, is it ethical to release such a language, or is it ethical to produce products that are used by groups we don't agree with?
I I believe that the way that we make change is that we continue to show up and we stay engaged. And that is at times, I think what is really important is for people to come together and understand their sphere of influence. So as an individual, I may have, there might be certain folks in my circle that I can listen and grow from, as well as help influence on the other side. So I think that the challenge may be when you start considering what your core values are. Yes, you likely won't have 100% alignment, but I think for us in actually starting to dialogue and have those hard conversations and have those hard kind of learnings along the way, that is showing up and doing the work. And it's by showing up and being sustained in the long term that I believe we actually can have change. So what's kind of interesting is the intersectionality of ethics and theories of change, which I did not get into necessarily here. But I think what that question gets to is thinking about what does change look like to you and how do you want to go about accomplishing that? And working within the paradigms and the structures we have, there are ways we can kind of set up ourselves to do that. So I think that kind of maybe digging further into that helps us understand either as an individual what we will or will not do, and then can help us lead to that question of, the idea of something being a binary as yes or no. Unfortunately, in computer programming, yes, we can have a 0 or a 1.
Right.
But I don't think, unfortunately, the real world is, the social world around us is quite like that. And I think that's the nuance where we as technologists can engage better with the folks who either are directly impacted by this, or we are actively showing up, listening and learning and applying those lessons to how we either opt to make tech or not do tech, or how we opt to make iterations on things as we move forward in time.
Whew, that's again, that's such a tricky topic to talk about, and I think you explain it very clearly, and I'm happy you were here to talk to us all about that. So I want to thank you for joining us today at the Python Web Conference.
Thank you.
We're honored to have such great speakers, and you are one of the many who were here. So it's been a great day. I've really been excited about it. I assume you'll be around or in Slack, maybe throughout the evening or tomorrow if people have more specific questions they want to ask you. You're obviously more than welcome to join us for the virtual cocktail hour that'll be happening about 5:15, and then we're going to go into like board game socials and things. So
I love it.
That'd be cool if you joined us for that, and if not, maybe we'll see you around tomorrow. But thanks again for being here with us. I love the fact that we have people in the community who are willing to step up, stand up, say what needs to be said, help people maybe make better decisions, and actually step up and be active. So very thoughtful. There's, again, lots of great comments are coming in on the Slack channel.
Well, thank you, Kelvin. I appreciate it. And I'll definitely take some time to go and look through those questions. And to everyone who's been participating in this conversation, thank you. Like, this is awesome. And I'm so glad to be in a space where we can engage one another like this.
Yeah, huge rounds of applause coming from everybody on all sides of the world right now.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much, Kelvin.
Thank
Y'all
you.
have a good evening or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are.
Excellent. We will be right back in about 5 minutes with some closing remarks, a little bit of housekeeping stuff, and then kind of introducing what's going to happen this evening with some of the social stuff. Again, Lorena, you're welcome to join us, but I will take a quick 2-minute break. We'll be back on the live stream in 5 minutes, so we'll see you soon.